My name is Carlos, and I'm not really sure what category this story falls into. I'd probably say it's a combination of paranormal and creature encounter. I think it's more of the latter, to be honest. I know that not many people are going to believe my story, but I've decided to submit it anyway. Maybe at the very least, somebody can be entertained by it. Anyways, it was a different world back in 2003. I was in my early 20s, single, and ready to mingle. I lived in an apartment complex in upstate New York at the time. Every balcony was draped with an American flag because 9/11 was still fresh in everyone's minds. I'm sure most people listening to this who are old enough to remember that era can tell you that America went through a wave of patriotism following the collapse of the Twin Towers. We did have internet back then, but there were no smartphones or dating apps. I remember that one of my friends had this flip phone with a built-in camera, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. Yeah, I'm old. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, I was in my dating phase, and there was this girl I had met at the neighborhood gym. Her name was Melissa. She was 5'9", had green eyes and tan skin that perfectly complemented her blonde hair. I was crazy about her, but I didn't want to come on too strong. So I began with casual conversation, and gradually became more and more flirtatious with her. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it worked for me. Come to find out, Melissa lived in the same apartment complex as me, so I made my move and asked her on a date.
Oh gosh, you seem like a really nice guy, but I just got out of a really bad relationship and I'm not looking to date anyone right now.
My heart sank. But as I said before, I was crazy about this girl, but I had to tread cautiously. Talking to girls that you don't know that well can be a lot like driving through a minefield. Make one wrong move and kaboom, you're finished. I understand, and I'm sorry if I just made things weird, but I had to tell you how I felt because it's been driving me nuts. I ended up being friend-zoned, but I had hoped that we could eventually become something more. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we had similar working hours, and we got off around the same time. There was this big lake at the center of our apartment complex, so we ended up taking these night strolls for a while, talking about our day and whatnot. My feelings for her did eventually come back up, and at the end of that conversation, she wrapped her arms around me and made out with me in front of my truck. I remembered her saying,
I'll see you next Tuesday,
before she gave me a smile and walked off. Tuesday rolled around, and she was nowhere to be found. I called her twice and left a voicemail, but I never heard back from her. 3 months passed. I didn't hear from her at all. She had disappeared completely. Of course, I was questioning if I had done anything wrong, but without her returning my phone calls, I had no way of getting to the bottom of it. I remembered thinking that she might have been kidnapped or something, but I didn't see any news reports about a missing 5'9" blonde girl in my area, so I just came to the conclusion that she had simply lost interest in me. I'm not going to lie, I was pretty heartbroken, but after 3 months with no contact, I had to move on with my life. It had been about 7 months since I last saw her, when I received a phone call one night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep when I answered. Hello?
Hello, Carlos. It's Melissa.
Melissa's voice was cold and emotionless, like she was reading from a script. Melissa? Where have you been?
Do you still want me?
What?
Do you still want me, Carlos?
I honestly don't know. You left without saying a word.
Can you meet me by the lake in 10 minutes? I'll explain everything. Please, Carlos.
I didn't know what to make of the situation. I was genuinely confused. Regardless of any feelings I had about Melissa, I wanted to know what the hell happened and why she vanished. I quickly put on some clothes, left my apartment, and headed downstairs towards the community lake. From the direction I approached, there was a bench next to the sidewalk with a large oak tree directly behind it. The lake walk closed down at midnight, so all the lights around the lake were turned off. The only thing providing any kind of illumination was a white exterior light mounted to the nearest apartment building on the left. I could see someone sitting on the bench. I suddenly stopped roughly 20 yards from them. Something inside me told me that I was in serious danger. I assumed the person sitting there was Melissa waiting for me. But something wasn't right. It felt like I was being set up. I slowly backed away. The figure suddenly stood up. I could see that it was clearly a woman with blonde hair, but her head began to shake violently from side to side, and her body began to twist and contort, shifting in frantic, unnatural movements. The dark shape then began to crawl towards me at an alarming speed. I wasted no time and hauled ass back to my building and charged up the stairs towards my apartment. I usually locked the door whenever I left my apartment, but this time I had left it unlocked and was able to immediately open it. As I did, I heard something from the bottom of the stairs call out to me.
No. Don't go.
It sounded like Melissa's voice, but something was off about it. It was like someone was struggling to imitate her. That's the best way I can describe it. I slammed my door shut, quickly grabbing the gun I kept in my nightstand, and aimed it at the door until morning. After that night, I never heard from Melissa again. I asked around the neighborhood, and no one seemed to know who she was. I even called the place she apparently worked at, and was told that no one named Melissa had ever worked there. It occurred to me that in all of my interactions with Melissa at the gym or on the lake walk, it had always been just me and her. No one ever saw us together. All these years later, this entire ordeal still perplexes me to no end. All I know is that whatever was waiting for me by the lake was inhuman. To start off, my name is Will, and I'm from a small town called Southampton in Massachusetts. I must say that this is a 100% true story that happened to my friends and I during the summer of 2019. Myself and my friends Edward, Will H., Frankie, and Rylan were all sleeping over at my friend Spencer's house. I should add that Spencer's house is on a dirt road between a hiking trail and a forest. So that night we all planned to go fishing at a creek a little ways down the hiking trail, and we brought some weed along with us to spice things up. We were just a bunch of dumb teenagers trying to have fun. Frankie was a bit apprehensive about going into the forest at night because he was nearly robbed by a homeless man in these same woods a few years prior. But we ended up convincing him that it would be fine because we were in a group. It was about 11 p.m. when we snuck past the living room where Spencer's dad was yelling at the TV about the Jacksonville Jaguars or something. I won't refer to him by his real name, but his nickname was Joey Bonanza, Joe for short. During our walk down to the creek, we were all laughing and talking about sports, girls, and all the other things that teenagers would talk about. Fast forward an hour later, and we were fishing by the creek. We were all pretty lit at this point, but Rylan was beyond the clouds, if you know what I mean. We were all just chatting when we heard a splash coming from the other side of the creek. We all looked over to Frankie, who was throwing some popcorn out of his backpack into the water. We chalked it up to a fish or a duck going after the popcorn. But Edward and I realized that the splashes were coming from the other side of the creek, opposite the flow. The popcorn would have gone downstream. We eventually lost interest in it and went back to fishing. I do remember walking over to Frankie and asking him why he was throwing popcorn into the creek. Because I'm bored and I'm also kind of paranoid. And I don't know, I just like watching the popcorn float in the water. Takes my mind off of things. About a half hour later, we heard more splashes coming from the other side of the creek, much louder this time. Edward shined his flashlight, but it was still hard to see anything because of the fog above the water. However, through the fog, we saw what looked like the top of someone's head poking out of the water. At first, we thought that it was some other person playing a joke on us. But then we saw its eyes. They were glowing. Not like an animal's eyes when you shine a light on them in the dark. These eyes were glowing by themselves. We all looked at each other. What the hell is that thing? That's when Rylan chimed in, high as a kite. Maybe you shouldn't have thrown the popcorn in the water and attracted it to us, dumbass. That's when the figure emerged from the water. It had to be at least 8 feet tall and resembled a humanoid. I'm not kidding, I know it sounds cliche, but we were all staring down a nightmare that came to life. My friends and I ditched our stash and our fishing poles and fled in the direction of Spencer's house. As we ran, this thing let out the most disturbing sound I've ever heard. After 5 minutes of running, Spencer's house came into view. We were all shouting things like, "What the fuck was that? Its eyes. Did you see its fucking eyes? Don't stop running and don't look behind you. We're almost there." We made it to Spencer's front yard. That's when his dad burst through the front door with his pistol and began firing rounds into the forest, almost hitting Edward in the arm. We ran onto the front porch, where Joe was screaming, "What the fuck do you think you're doing? I could have killed one of you. I thought someone was trying to steal my moonshine again." Joe was drunk, and apparently was illegally hiding moonshine somewhere in the woods. One of the neighbors ended up calling the police because they heard Spencer's dad shouting and firing his pistol. Needless to say, when the cops showed up, they arrested Joe because he didn't have a firearms permit and was also blackout drunk. When he was escorted out of the house, he drunkenly told the cops, "Can you guys check to see if my moonshine was stolen?" I probably would have never thought about writing this, but I was in an Xbox party with Spence last night, and he convinced me to send this in. So, yeah, we haven't told anyone else about this since it happened. I've since moved away from Massachusetts, but I'm still in contact with my friends from this story, and we still can't explain what we saw in the creek that night. You don't have to believe me, and I don't blame you if you don't. If I wasn't with my friends that night, I would question that this ever happened. But I was there, and I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And to this day, I still get the chills whenever I think about it. I can guarantee you one thing. I will never go into those woods at night, ever again.
My girlfriend Holly and I are in an on-again, off-again long-distance relationship. I live in Manhattan and she lives in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, our schedules make it difficult to see each other. Since our time together is usually limited to weekends and the occasional holiday, we decided to take off the same week from our jobs this past summer. I drove up on Friday afternoon with my German Shepherd Thea. We arrived around midnight. I was pretty exhausted from the 4-hour drive. The next day, Holly and I talked about possible close-by vacation spots. But every option was way too expensive and too far away. On Sunday, Holly found out that a friend of hers wasn't using their vacation home on the lake. They said that we could stay there for the remainder of the week, and we gratefully accepted. The house was fairly isolated, with the nearest neighbor being across the water. We were also surrounded by a thick forest. The next 2 days passed by without much incident. I was a lot more uneasy while trying to fall asleep, but I chalked that up to the anxiety of being in a new place. The third night is when things took a turn for the worse. I woke up to Thea growling, which immediately set me on edge because she's the most well-tempered dog I've ever had. She was lying at the end of our bed, so I petted her and offered her a spot between Holly and me to spend the rest of the night. She wouldn't budge. "What's wrong, girl?" I asked her, but she paid me no attention. I followed her gaze and realized she was staring at the window. The curtains were covering it. I was getting very uneasy at the thought that something could be on the other side. I swallowed my fear and decided to take a look at what was bothering Thea. As I neared the window, she barked loudly and jumped off the bed, waking up Holly. "What's the matter?" she asked, and I explained the situation. "It's probably just a wild animal," Holly told me, and I nodded, wanting to believe she was right. I pulled back the blinds and saw that there was nothing there before getting back into bed. Thea whined, but eventually settled down a few minutes later, although for the rest of the night her ears would perk up at every sound coming from outside. The next morning we decided to eat breakfast on the deck outside. My anxiety from the night before had vanished. I don't think Holly even remembered what happened the previous night. Even I had almost forgotten about my dog's odd behavior because she was acting as she normally did, lying on my feet under the table. We were all pretty relaxed and spent a good 45 minutes outside before Thea leapt to her feet, transfixed on the forest. My dog stayed in a protective stance and started snarling. The events from the previous night came flooding back to me. Holly and I stood up. I was nervous that she would take off running into the woods, so I grabbed her by the collar and struggled to get her back inside. After everyone was safely inside, Holly and I talked about what was happening. Holly was still keen on the idea of it being a wild animal, and I agreed because this area was known for the occasional bear sighting. For the rest of the day, we both tried to forget about Thea's unusual behavior, but that night, things took a turn for the worse. It was about 9 p.m. and we had settled into watching a movie on the couch. The way the house was set up, there were windows on either side of us. Being a fairly paranoid person, I was already a little on edge because of this. Holly fell asleep around 9:30, and I was getting tired not long after. I switched the TV off, leaving us in the dark. I now had a clearer view of the outside, but with my dog and Holly both there, I was relaxed, and I allowed myself to doze off. I woke up around midnight. Holly was sort of lying on top of me, and Thea was in a deep sleep, half on my legs and half on the footrest, so my movement was limited. The first thing I did was check my phone. Mistake number 1. I decided to try to go back to sleep, but something outside caught my eye. Since Thea wasn't growling, I wanted to let it go, but an instinctual part of me knew better. I focused on the window that looked out across the deck and tried to make out what it was. 5 minutes went by, and finally, there was some movement among the trees. At first I thought it was just the wind causing one of these trees to move, but then I realized it wasn't a tree at all. Whatever it was looking into the house, watching us. It knew I was awake. Soon it emerged from the woods. It vaguely resembled a man, so I assumed that's what it was. My second mistake. Frightened, I woke up Holly and explained to her what was going on and that I was going outside to yell at the guy to get him off the property. She warned me that this wasn't a good idea, but I didn't listen to her. We were both petite women, and whoever this was outside had probably determined that we were alone. It was a dumb thing to do, but I was pissed. The stalker was ruining our vacation, and I wanted to show him that I wasn't afraid. I'm a little bit more intimidating than my girlfriend, being a couple inches taller and having a resting bitch face. But if anyone in that house was going to freak this guy out, it was Thea, who was now wide awake and once again baring her teeth at the window. I switched the deck light on and walked out into the deck with Thea. I held her tightly by the collar so she wouldn't take off. Holly watched us from the inside, giving me a worried look, but didn't say anything else. It was so dark outside that I couldn't see anything, so I figured the stalker had bolted when he saw the light turn on. But to be sure, he wasn't just still hiding somewhere. I started yelling. "Hey! Get the fuck off our property! The police are already on their way and we have an attack dog. And she'll tear you a new asshole!" I stood out there listening for a few minutes, but all I could hear was my dog's barking, which was growing increasingly furious. Just when I was about to say screw it and go back inside, there was an ear-splitting shriek from the darkness. A tall, pale figure stepped out of the tree line. It was a bony creature with limited facial features. The nails that protruded from its fingers must have been a foot long. One word immediately came to mind. Skinwalker. As soon as it emerged, Thea went absolutely nuts. Honestly, I would have stood there frozen until it was too late if it wasn't for her. I snapped out of my trance and struggled to pull her inside. "We're leaving," Holly said before grabbing the keys to the car. The driveway was on the other side of the house. We piled into the car as fast as possible and drove an hour and a half to the nearest motel. I was pretty shaken up the whole drive there. "You saw it, right?" I asked Holly. She nodded. "I've never seen anything like that before." The next day we had to return to the house to grab our things. Thankfully, nothing happened. On the way home, we called Holly's friend, who owned the house. We told him everything. He was quiet for a few moments before saying,
When I first bought the place a couple years ago, my wife said that she saw the same thing, crouching down outside the bedroom window. She felt like something had been following us for that entire weekend.
"I haven't been back to that part of New Hampshire since last summer. If you are left with anything from this story, take my advice. Trust your animals. They know better than us and can sense things that we can't. They may end up saving your life."
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I want to give a huge shout out to Deadjosey for helping me out with today's video. She runs a really cool motion comic channel, which I'll link in the description. I've been featured in a few of her recent videos, so I hope you check them out. And as always, if anyone has any stories they would like to share on this channel, please send them to my email, unit522stories@outlook.com. I hope to hear from you. Until then, stay safe and never forget. There's always a reason to be afraid.